So this is not really a necessarily one story that make you jump out of your seat, but it's definitely one story that definitely really kind of freaked one of my friends out. Now, for context, my friend was living somewhere in New York at the time, and this was during a bad snowstorm. My friend's name at the time was Jay, and he was pretty much in sophomore year of college. This happened to take place sometime in 2017, and since then, this was definitely something he really get freaked out at. Every now and then, they do get a snowstorm, and some days where it gets really bad, and some days it's not that bad. However, though, there was one day where Jay ended up seeing something that really freaked him out. Now, to make it a long story short, he was living in the streets of New York at the time, and while he was there, he was basically driving home one night in the cold of New York City. As he was driving, he ended up looking over to see that there was a man. He appeared to be cold, so he decided to pull over and ask him if he needed any help. As he did that, the man was didn't say anything, which was very strange. It really kind of made him a little nervous since this man didn't seem to notice him or take acknowledge, and he doesn't even seem to notice him either. So he just stared at him. It wasn't until maybe a few minutes later where the man walks up to Jay in his car and said, "Oh, can I get a ride?" Of course, Jay decided to give this guy a ride and he let him in the car. Once he did that, they started driving, and Jay asked where he needed to go, and the man ended up explaining where he wanted to go and stuff like that. So he went to the location and eventually dropped the man off. And as he watched the man walk in, that's when Jay noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He noticed that there was someone else not far from where he was standing. At first, he wasn't too sure as to who it was, but as it gets apparent, he realized that there was someone else. He comes out and he ends up looking over the car and walked around while Jay was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Now, this was making him really uncomfortable as he didn't know who this man was. But as soon as Jay could, he ended up spading off and driving off into the night. When Jay got home, he ended up pretty much paranoid and a little concerned of what those men were doing. He had no idea what those men were doing and wasn't so sure what the men's intentions were, but it definitely was something that really freaked him out. So the next day, which happens to be not a really bad snowstorm, but apparently it was on the news flash that Jay watched, and apparently it was about two men who broke into a house and stole valuables from an older couple. It turns out that a lot of jewelry and money were stolen, and it turns out that the elderly couple hadn't been in the house since they were both gone out of state for at least a few days. That was definitely the most disturbing thing that Jay has ever experienced. Now, maybe those men were trying to think of maybe stealing Jay's car, but that was a mystery that Jay has no idea. He doesn't even want to know if those men were out there, and he moved out of New York at least 2 months later. He moved to Oregon, and it's a more lovely area and a more peaceful. He would never forget this moment in the snowstorm of what really happened to him. Now, this happened a friend of mine, and this was sometime around 2015. I can't remember sometime in 2015, but I'm guessing it might have been somewhere in January. It was around the time when everyone was going back to school after being off from the Christmas holidays. My friend at the time, I am going to say his name. His name was Drake, and Drake was pretty much in sophomore year of high school. Now, he was with his older brother, as his older brother had to go out of town to get some stuff, so Drake asked if he can go with his brother, as he had some allowance money and he wanted to get at least a few school supplies. Drake's older brother said of course, and they drove. However, his brother liked to take the back roads, as even though it's longer, it's definitely a pretty quiet road. The road was pretty quiet as the traffic wasn't so crazy, so it was occasion to go through it. When Drake and his brother were on the road in the back road, Drake was pretty much on his phone just gaming when his brother ended up seeing that there was a lot of snow. It was heavy snowfall, and that's when Drake's brother had to take his time and was being as careful as he could not to slip on the road. As he was doing this, that was when Drake was kept playing on his phone. However, he didn't pay attention very much to the road as Drake's brother was doing that job. While on the phone, that's when Drake's brother let out an "oh shit" and stops the car by slamming the brakes. Now, Drake at first said, "What the fuck, man?" But of course, Drake's brother said that he had saw something running across the road about a couple miles away. That's when his brother pulls over and takes out a flashlight and walks on the road. As he walks on the road, he looks around, but he couldn't see anyone or anything. He looked to see the footprints, but at first he thought that it could have been a bear, but it didn't look like bear prints. It looked some sort of abnormal creature. He didn't even know what it was, but something definitely ran across the road in the middle of the dark, snowy night. What really freaked him out was that the fact that whatever it was massive. Now, they weren't sure as to what it was, and maybe he thought that it could have been maybe a person, but there was no way to know for sure. Drake got back in his car, and same with his brother, and they continued on the road. On the way back, they went slow on the back roads, and as they were heading home, they didn't see anything, and they were checking their surroundings, making sure whoever it was wasn't around to jump out and scare them. However, that's when Drake's brother pulls off to the side of the road to take a phone call from his girlfriend. While he was on the phone with his girlfriend, something about maybe a couple feet ahead of them, maybe around 20 feet near the headlights, was walking across the road. Whatever it was didn't look like a human. It looked more like an animal. Now, Drake obviously said that to his brother, and his brother looked up. However, when they both looked up, they can see that it disappeared off into the night. They weren't sure as to what it was, so they went out of the car to investigate. While they were outside, they ended up looking at the footprints, and it did look like that it was definitely an animal. What kind of animal was walking on two legs, walking across the road like that? Was it a person? Was it an animal? That was definitely something Drake and his brother had no idea. However, they had thought that maybe it could have been a bear, but it didn't look like a bear. They weren't sure as to what this creature was as it disappeared into the woods. Now, they continued on their way home, and they were silent until they got back into town. Now, Drake and his brother don't know if it was a person or if it was Bigfoot. Now, this happened to my friend Luna at the time of this story. My friend Luna lives somewhere in the USA, and it was around maybe Illinois. Now, as she was living there, she was living in an area where they get a lot of snow, and it happened to be on one of the most biggest cities to ever get a lot of snow. While Luna was basically playing video games one night, This was happened maybe about a year or so ago. While Luna was pretty much on her phone scrolling through Facebook, it was a really bad snowstorm outside, meaning that school would be closed the next day. She was on her phone basically scrolling and talking with some of her friends, and she happened to be home alone. When she happened to be home alone most of the time, her parents trust her to watch the house and trusted by the rules such as don't let anyone in she doesn't know, etc. Now Luna was on her phone basically FaceTiming when she all of a sudden heard a knock on the door. At first she thought that maybe it could have been her parents' home, but they were working late, so she ended up getting up and looking through the door through the peephole. However, she did that, but she couldn't find anyone, and there were no footprints on the snow indicating that someone was there. She ends up deciding maybe just to ignore it, or if maybe it was someone ding-dong ditching, and she continued to be on her phone. Fast forward maybe about 20 minutes later, she heard that knock again, and this time she looked for the peephole, but she still couldn't see anyone. She opened the door and looked out from the front porch, looking around to make sure nobody was hiding in an attempt to scare her or do God knows what. Keep in mind that he was 18 at the time of the story, so when she looked around, she couldn't find anyone. There were no footprints in the snow indicating that someone was around, so that didn't really make sense as to who was doing the knocking. She ends up closing the door after going back in, and she ended up deciding to watch some TV. Now, about 5 minutes later, she heard the knock again. This time it was a bit louder. She ends up going to the door, but she couldn't see anyone through the peephole, and now she was starting to get a little annoyed, like whoever the fuck was playing around was definitely trying to get her patience tested up. Now, just as Luna was about to turn away for a second, she heard the knock again. This time she opens the door to find absolutely no one. She obviously had called her dad and asked what she could do, and her dad suggested to call the police. Now, she called the police, and the police took her statement, but they patrolled the area to see if they can catch anybody who was knocking at their door. Now, nothing like that has happened throughout the night, and there was no reports about someone going around knocking on doors. Now, Luna thought maybe it could be her imagination, maybe a ding-dong ditcher, or maybe it was something paranormal. She has no idea what it was to this day, and that still confuses her to this day.